with destiny.
This was their fighting power.
I think that we can do better in this
Why,
country.
are you crazy? The fall will probably kill you.
Everybody has 3 mortgages nowadays.
In, and always shall be, your friend.
Thanks for always being there, Doc.
Thomas Jefferson survives.
Welcome to Bromances of History, friendships that changed the world. I'm your host, Bo Hammond, and this is part 2 of a multi-chapter series on Abraham Lincoln and William Henry Seward. In this episode, a 4-way election, secession winter, a tearful goodbye, and buying time. You know what I originally thought would be one episode turned into a 2-episode deal? Apologies. And I'm guessing this whole shindig will be a 5-part bromance, and I am just as excited as you to find out. This is brought to you by me, again. Though a tremendous shout out to my very first Patreon supporter, Philip S. Thank you so much. You're basically buying me a beer every month, and that really helps with research. You have no idea. And thank you to all those who left reviews on Apple Podcasts. And the books that I quote and use for research are on bromancesofhistory.com in the library section. It's a great way to support the podcast by buying a book. And you get a book. You're welcome. In this episode, I tried to change it up, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it. I'm still sipping writer's tears. And hey, look, I'd fly to Ireland just to get their redhead and cognac versions. And no, they didn't pay me to say that, though I should probably email them. Anyway, as always, there are many quotes, throughout the show. And yeah, one day I'll do a quote book. And here's the first. It is much better for parties or politicians to be turned out of office than to imperil the life of the nation. Winston Churchill. Seward's pale face flushed with color again, and in an instant, he stoically regained control. Of those present in the garden on that sunny day, William Henry Seward was the most composed. And after rereading the telegram he had just been handed, he said, quote, "Well, Mr. Lincoln will be elected, and has some of the qualities to make a good president." His daughter Fanny wrote in her diary that amongst all of his despairing friends, that, quote, "he alone has a smile. He takes it with philosophical and unselfish coolness," end quote. Of course, he's only human, and philosophy goes only so far. Back in Springfield, Lincoln was in the offices of the Illinois State Journal. And when the decision of the convention arrived, he commented, "I knew this would come when I saw the second ballot." And amongst all the congratulations and cheers, he shook hands, made jokes to those around him, finally saying, "Well, gentlemen, there's a little woman in our house who is probably more interested in this dispatch than I am." And given Mary's ambition, this was almost true. But Abraham had been working towards a chance like this since he escaped the rule of his father's house. In Auburn, New York, Seward comforted Thurlow Weed by writing to him that he had his unbounded gratitude. Nor Henry, shortly after the convention, wrote a ringing public endorsement of the man who had defeated him in Chicago. Such is the world of politics. And yet, many supporters still wrote to him that it was he who would be the 1864 nominee, that this Lincoln fella was just a placeholder. It was really Seward who would be next. And all of this amongst the wreckage of his final hope and his life ambition. And Walter Starr has this great quote from Seward in his book. And this is Seward speaking, by the way. Quote, "I had the rare experience of a man walking about town after he is dead and hearing what people would say of him. I confess I was unprepared for so much real grief as I heard expressed at every corner." End quote. In reality, Seward was tired and even a bit chagrined. He basically said, to hell with it. I'm done with politics. I've given people enough of my life. And he decides not to seek re-election to the Senate. He'd serve out the remainder of his term through the end of 1861. And Frances, his wife, she was thrilled. She was to get her Henry back after decades of public service, after decades of sharing him with the people. And Seward did not plan to take part in the campaign for his own party's nominee. Lincoln let it be known to all Seward supporters and all factions of the new Republican Party that if elected, his policy would be justice and fairness to all. It's a quote, justice and fairness to all. For him, all factions were forgotten and forgiven. Equal footing would be given to all in the new administration. And so you could forgive some political observers and some political veterans that this might just be talking points, or assuming that these were mere platitudes. The political situation was one of the most fascinating in American history. Hannibal Hamlin of Maine, senator, former Democrat, he was named the vice presidential nominee, and he was more experienced than Lincoln, as could be said by many or most folks in the presidential race and the future cabinet. Now, Lincoln was so unknown. At times, he had to correct newspapers and others about whether his name was Abraham or Abram. Yeah, Abram. Not a good sign. And back then, it was seen as unseemly or improper to openly campaign for yourself. So no huge rallies, no long cross-country campaign trails over thousands of miles. Presidential candidates were expected to stay at home and leave this distasteful art of political campaigning to the party or other statesmen and allies. Seward was needed. And the Republican nominee adhered to this old system, but he was hardly idle. So, in fact, he ran, I guess, what could be called a stealth campaign from Springfield. And Lincoln and his two new secretaries, John Nicolay and John Hay, who, by the way, they're going to be by his side throughout the entire administration, the entire war. They moved into the Illinois governor's office and set up a temporary HQ. And there, Lincoln would meet thousands of people throughout the campaign. From there, he would send out personal emissaries to strategic areas to campaign on his behalf, and he would send countless letters across the country to answer questions and shore up support. He was very much, I guess you could say, actively engaged in his own campaign, often coordinating with the Republican chairman, one Thurlow Weed. In this campaign of 1860, Lincoln had been deemed the rail splitter, to play up his humble roots. Roots, by the way, that were so humble, he spent the majority of his waking and working life escaping them. He was not proud of this poverty. Or, as one of my favorite authors has written, quote, poverty entails fear and stress and sometimes depression. It means 1,000 petty humiliations and hardships. Climbing out of poverty by your own efforts, that is indeed something on which to pride yourself. But poverty itself is romanticized only by fools. End quote. Welcome to politics. Now, Lincoln would wholeheartedly agree with these sentiments. And he's a politician and fully realized how useful the rail splitter image in the campaign would be. You see, rail splitting was this task of the common laborer, where a person would split pieces of wood for building fences and the like. It's not glorious work. By the way, there's an entire Lincoln podcast called The Rail Splitters. They dive in deep on all different aspects of Abraham Lincoln. In fact, I hung out with these guys one night and we did a Lincoln online trivia. I was on their team. Guess who won? Yes, I know. I'm a nerd, okay? Anyway, check out their podcast. Tell them I sent you. You're welcome. Where was I? Right. Oh, before the showdown in Chicago, in the middle of the Illinois State Republican Convention, to nominate their favorite son, a cousin of Lincoln and other supporters burst into the hall, and they're carrying these rails, purportedly split by Lincoln himself. Looking them over, Honest Abe said he couldn't be sure about these particular rails, but that he had split many like them. The crowd went wild. The nickname stuck. Now, in a country of common laborers, it helps to have been one of them to win their votes. It means that you understand their struggles and where they're coming from. And the rail splitter, he represented the right to rise, the American promise. And of course, we know that this promise has been restricted by race and religion and gender and other aspects over the generations. We are better than we were, and we can be better yet. But I digress, sorry. The political landscape of the election of 1860. Now, this would only be remembered the second presidential race for this Republican Party. Their main opponents would be the Democrats, who were themselves divided by section. And I can't stress this enough, that these parties are nothing like their modern inheritors or iterations. Remember, the Whig Party's dead, along with the Know-Nothing Party and all these other wandering political factions. Now, as we all know, third parties are doomed to fail in America. Just look at Teddy Roosevelt, the bull moose himself. But this election had broken into a four-way race. And as we know from history, anything can happen in a four-way. Let me take a sip of whiskey. Thank you very much. Damn, that's good. Where was I? The first Democratic convention in Charleston, South Carolina. They met before the showdown in Chicago. But this had ended without a nominee. Southern fire eaters had walked out in protest of the frontrunner Stephen Douglas. And the refusal to be far more pro-slavery. Remember that the popular sovereignty of Douglas could potentially limit slavery's expansion. And so he was unacceptable to the slave powers as a candidate. And if you think I'm just being hyperbolic or I'm full of it, please read the secession convention statements and their reasons for leaving our union. They are what I would call enlightening documents. So here's how it is. The Democratic Party split into two factions, North and South. Both would have separate conventions. You don't have to remember all the details I'm about to tell you or all the names that follow. The Northern Democrats, though, they nominate the little giant, Stephen Douglas. The Southern Democrats nominate the current Vice President, John C. Breckinridge. And some remnants of Southern Whigs and Know-Nothings, they form the Fourth Party in the Mid-Atlantic Upper South region. And they're called the Constitutional Union Party. They nominate John Bell and running mate Edward Everett. Ooh, no, remember that name. That name will come back. Anyway, all of these men will have their parts to play in the coming crisis. The one to watch is Stephen Douglas in the North. He is a skilled campaigner and public speaker. He breaks tradition to campaign openly for himself on the trail. And the probability of victory is with the Republicans. But if Douglas wins only a few northern states instead of Lincoln, then no one wins, and the election goes to the House of Representatives, where the rail splitter will surely fall. Douglas must be countered. Seward's friends and allies insisted that he must enter the arena. The angels of his nature got the better of him. To add to his earlier public letter supporting Lincoln, he would deploy himself in 9 states on the campaign trail. And as Doris Kearns Goodwin writes, Lincoln worked behind the scenes while, quote, Seward stepped forward to speak on public issues and provide the drama and excitement of the campaign. Seward was a monumental force in getting Lincoln elected. He's crisscrossing northern and western states by train and steamboat and carriage. He addressed thousands at a time with articulate speeches. And some of this gauntlet is fueled by brandy and cigars and all by hard work. Raise a glass. Cheers. Excuse me. During this crisscrossing campaign, Seward stopped in Springfield, where the rail splitter briefly met with him inside the train car. And the rendezvous was described as strained and awkward. The New Yorker then gave a short speech on the platform and moved on to Chicago. And I'm no time-traveling mind reader, but I imagine it was a painful experience for Henry. I mean, how could he stand there in that train car and not think to himself, it should have been me? Nonetheless, the campaign continues. Seward, Lincoln, and Republican leaders just did not see the threats of secession as serious. They thought the South was just crying wolf, as it had in the days of Jackson and nullification, and over the course of the last generation. At one large campaign speech, Seward even openly mocked Southern leaders, saying before the crowd, quote, "They cry out that they will tear the Union into pieces. Who's afraid? Nobody's afraid." And all his audiences would shout back, "Nobody!" And Seward returned home a month before Election Day to discover that the situation in New York had deteriorated. With 35 electoral votes, New York held the key to victory. And consider for a moment the disenchanted Seward supporters. Look, there are guys not on the ticket. There's multiple candidates in the race, so there's a danger of splitting support. And with a large Democratic presence, look, ladies and gentlemen, this state is in play. And while Seward was out of these 9 different states on the campaign trail going to the mat for Lincoln, a fusion ticket of all Lincoln's opponents had gained ground in New York. And if successful, the election could be thrown into the House of Representatives, where Lincoln, as we've said before, he has no hope of success. So the stakes are clear. Lose New York, lose the nation. Lose the Empire State, you lose the Great Republic. If Seward made a last stand, he might be able to turn the tide in New York. And fight he did. The vote was close in many free states, and the votes and voices of just a few people could have changed the course of the whole country. They always can. The world did not have to be this way. There are always paths not taken, and tomorrow can be different. So for the sake of the Republic and all things good, vote! Vote, damn you! But I digress. Election Day. In Springfield, Illinois, it was electric. At the center of all this excitement is a calm Abraham Lincoln, or at least he's outwardly calm. He thought it improper to actually vote for himself. So he cuts his name off the top of the ballot, and he votes for the rest of the people on there. And election night stretches on, and as results started to come in over the telegraph wires, each with a fresh wave of applause and cheers and toasts. The first is the western states. Those are the closest to Lincoln. And then the east. Pennsylvania rolls in. Thank you, Simon Cameron. But still, Lincoln would not fully celebrate until he was certain. All eyes looked to New York. And some went home and drifted off to an uneasy sleep. But Lincoln and many supporters, they held firm. And 2 hours past midnight, New York reported its results. For once in his life, Lincoln had defeated Stephen Douglas, this time for the highest office in the land. And though with only 40% or so of the vote, he carried the Electoral College. And let me be clear that he still won the popular vote. And Thurlow Weed and William Henry Seward had done their jobs. As Walter Starr has written, quote, "In the final weeks of the campaign, Seward did more than any other man to achieve the election of Lincoln," end quote. In those dark morning hours, Lincoln went home to tell his anxious wife. And he's bursting through the doors, and he cried out, "Mary, Mary, we are elected." And Lincoln later wrote of that long night, quote, "I went home, but not to get much sleep, for I then felt as never I had before the responsibility that was upon me." From that night on, he knew he would use the cabinet as a tool to unite the fragile alliance of the Republican Party. Remember, some of the old loyalties and philosophies still held sway. There were still old Whigs and Free Soilers and Know-Nothings and immigrants and anti-slavery Democrats in this big tent. For the chief post, Secretary of State, he knew he needed Seward. And the senator expected no less. He had helped win this great victory. That night, the president-elect wrote down the names of his proposed cabinet. He would get all but two of them. And some of the names he wrote you'll recognize: Seward, Bates, Dayton, Judd, Chase, Blair, Wells. They all represented different regions and past alliances. Lincoln wanted the best and the brightest around him in Washington. Or, as Doris Kearns Goodwin has related about LBJ, quote, "It's better to have them on the inside of the tent pissing out than on the outside pissing in." The election of Lincoln, it unleashed shockwaves in Dixie. His name had not even appeared on the ballot in 10 southern states. So we know that slavery is at the core issue of the Civil War. But what triggered secession? It was the election of Lincoln. Not anything that he did, not anything that he said. It was what he represented. He achieved victory without a single southern state. And this signaled a tectonic shift of political power away from the slave states. Their fate, some argued, was out of their hands unless they took it back. And this demonstrates the dangers, even generations ago, of information echo chambers, or it's better to say disinformation echo chambers, and overly politicized news sources. Southern, and many Northern, newspapers, they twisted the words of Lincoln and Seward, or they simply invented policy positions for them that had no basis in objective reality. And please know that these dangers are not locked in the far-off past. They have stalked us through the years down to the present day. This is serious. Or as Lincoln wrote about these echo chambers and those that fed them, quote, "These political fiends are not half sick enough yet. Party malice, and not public good, possess them entirely." Many long and turbulent months lay between Election Day and the day of the inauguration, March 4th, 1861. Months in which the president-elect had no real power. He'd have to count on the wisdom and strength of President Buchanan. Good luck! And all the while, he had to construct a cabinet, navigate the political waters of his own party, and all the office seekers, and he'd have to prepare to move his whole life and family to Washington, D.C. In response to the election of Lincoln, without waiting for his oath or actions, the leaders of South Carolina approved a secession convention to decide this issue. And other southern state governments soon followed, and I urge you to read these final proclamations of these conventions. Again, they are enlightening. For at least 3 months after his election, Lincoln issued no public statement. No, nothing. He's silent from Springfield. So, not wanting to be misrepresented and fuel Southern fire. So Springfield stayed silent. And while that happened, loud and shrill voices were raised elsewhere in the country. He and Seward operated under a a flawed assumption, or is a mistaken belief that there would be this rising tide of Southern Unionism that would extinguish the fires of war and reassert reason. Time had to be bought for this silent majority, so the thinking went. And pressure was mounting from many quarters, South as well as North, for Lincoln to conciliate or compromise or to say something. For folks that wanted him to soothe Southern rage or address slavery concerns, meaning the concerns of the masters, Lincoln would say, quote, "I could say nothing which I have not already said, and which is in print and accessible to the public." So back to navigating the political waters of his own party. After the November victory, Thurlow Weed was dispatched to Springfield a number of times. You see, the partnership of Seward and Weed, they wanted to dominate the cabinet selection process and thus the cabinet itself. Lincoln, for his part, he desired a diversity of viewpoints and factions, not old Whig control by another name. So he told Thurlow Weed that he needed his opponents from the convention, all of them, because, quote, their long experience in public affairs and their eminent fitness. They had, quote, higher claims than his own for the place he was to occupy, end quote. Basically, it's a compact cabinet, or what Doris Kearns Goodwin calls a team of rivals. And in December of that secession winter, Senator Seward returned to the Capitol, determined to avert fraternal war. He quietly hoped that conciliation and moderation would carry the day, that the founders' experiment might continue without bloody war. And who knows, perhaps wisdom could prevail. And Henry listened to President Buchanan's address to Congress, where he said secession is wrong and illegal, but the federal government has no power to prevent it. To which Seward commented, quote, "shows conclusively that it is the duty of the president to execute the laws, unless somebody opposes him, and that no state has the right to go out of the Union, unless it wants to," end quote. This State of the Union address on December 3rd undermined the Union itself. All expected, and Lincoln fully intended to give the State Department to Seward. Those wishing to undermine this creation of the new administration, or perhaps it's just old enemies of Seward finally drawing their knives out, and they began to whisper and spread rumors that Lincoln actually didn't want the New Yorker in his high councils, that the president-elect only wanted to offer Seward the State Department as a flattering gesture, a PR stunt, with the expectation that the offer would be turned down. Then, with a free hand, Lincoln would choose who he truly wanted. Word of this reached not only Seward, but also Simon Cameron of Pennsylvania. Yeah, the same Simon Cameron, remember, who threw his key support behind Lincoln in Chicago and turned the tide. He would be, by the way, the first Secretary of War in the new cabinet. And he sent a message to Seward, quote, "You will be offered the State Department within a few days, and you must not refuse it. The whole victory achieved by the labor of so many years will be lost if you run away now. My whole ambition is to see you in the presidency." But hey, gun instinct, I'm just going to call bullshit on that last part. We all remember Chicago. The problematic rumors were now circulating in the partisan press of the day. And the rail splitter acted quickly, dispatching his vice president-elect Hannibal Hamlin to D.C. with 2 confidential letters. Remember, in that Washington winter, no states had yet rebelled. And Hamlin approached Seward, and according to Doris Kearns Goodwin, Seward first responded, quote, "If that is what you have come to talk to me about, we might as well stop here. I don't want the place. And if I did, I have reason to know that I could not get it. Therefore, let us have no more talk about it." At this, Hamlin handed Seward the 2 letters. And the first letter was just a simple official offer, saying that Lincoln would like to nominate him for Secretary of State. And this was the offer that was long expected. of which all the rumors spoke of. The second letter was private and far more important because I believe it soothed Seward's injured ego. The personal matters in politics. In this second letter, the president-elect wrote, quote, "Rumor has gotten into the newspapers to the effect that the department named above would be tendered to you as a compliment and with the expectation that you would decline it. I beg you to be assured that I have said nothing to justify these rumors. On the contrary, it has been my purpose from the day of the nomination at Chicago to assign you, by your leave, this place in the administration." And this next part, I think, is the respectful repair of Seward's ego. Continuing the quote, "I now offer you the place in the hope that you will accept it, and with the belief that your position in the public eye, your integrity, ability, learning, and great experience all combine to render it an appointment preeminently fit to be made." End quote. Seward was reassured. He was even flattered, but he maneuvered and delayed, writing to Lincoln that he would need some more time to think it over. And meanwhile, secession was building to a boil in the South. That was the 13th of December. Let me take a quick sip here, sorry. A few days later, on the 20th, Thurlow Weed arrived in Springfield to meet with Lincoln. He's going to discuss the cabinet. And of course, Weed represented the interests and the thinking of his best friend. His objective was to insert a pro-Seward council around the president so that the real power of the executive branch would be the Secretary of State. And it shocked Weed when his suggestions were not only shot down, but the president-elect would name many unfriendly foes of Seward to important cabinet posts, men such as Salmon Chase. Oh, God, I hate that guy. Montgomery Blair and Gideon Welles. Oh, Chase is the worst. Lincoln carefully selected a cabinet based on old political origins, experience, and geography. He and Weed went back and forth in a debate. And near the end of this meeting, Weed objected that there would be a majority of old Democrats instead of Whigs in the cabinet. And the Whigs were the chief power base of this new Republican Party. And Lincoln smiled at this. And he said, quote, "You seem to forget that I expect to be there. And counting me as one, you see how nicely the cabinet would be balanced and ballasted." Seriously, guys, read Team of Rivals. Cheers. Weed returned to the East with new respect for Lincoln, but not loyalty. In later discussions with Seward, he mused whether or not his friend should even accept the cabinet post. And that same December day, in the Capitol building of the United States, Senator Seward was in meetings of a 13-member compromise committee that included in its number Stephen Douglas. How could they possibly know that their efforts were in vain? For at that very hour, 5 days before Christmas, South Carolina seceded from her sister states and from her nation. The Union was broken. And the act of destroying the federal government because of a lost election is not an act of peace. It's not an act of democracy. A day after Christmas, Seward wrote a letter to Lincoln about his belief in a rising tide of Southern Unionism, that it would be growing in the coming months. Get this, all right, here's what he writes, quote, "Sedition will be growing weaker and loyalty stronger every day from the acts of secession as they occur," end quote. He was wrong. But on the 28th, he finally agreed to serve as the Secretary of State. And after his acceptance, he wrote to his wife, quote, "I have advised Mr. L. that I will not decline. It is inevitable. I will try to save freedom and my country." He knew what was at stake. there would be no quiet retirement. Not anymore. And by New Year's, Seward was convinced of the real possibility of a plot to seize Washington on or before March 4th. Remember, that's the inauguration. In the Buchanan administration, there was a new attorney general by the name of Edwin Stanton. And if President Buchanan would do nothing, at least Stanton would put country above party. He became Seward's eyes and ears inside the White House. By January 1861, the senator from New York was working frantically behind the scenes to explore the possibility of compromise and really to prepare for the real possibility of civil war. The situation could not be more serious. And Stanton and Seward even had a secret go-between so that as they would never appear in public together. And according to Walter Starr, by January, Seward had asked the governors of New York and Massachusetts to have their militias ready to quickly move in defense of the capital if necessary. Remember, he is only a senator at this point, not wielding real power. He's not Secretary of State yet. And he also worked quietly, of course, with the General-in-Chief, Winfield Scott, to determine which local militia units were trustworthy. By January 11th, in quick succession, Florida, little slip there, but one after the other, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, beacons of civilization that they've always been, they all seceded from the United States. And hey, look, I can make fun of them. I can give them shit, damn it. After all, I'm a son of the South, and I love it. At this point in time, the all-important border states had yet to choose their path, though Georgia and Louisiana soon followed the Deep South into rebellion. As a Buchanan did nothing to stop the destruction of the American experiment. Federal arsenals and forts across the South were illegally seized. Eventually, only Fort Pickens off the coast of Florida and Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor remained. That's it. That's all we got, 2 forts. On January the 10th, a supply ship named the Star of the West attempted to reach Fort Sumter in South Carolina. It was fired upon and turned away without casualties. But still, Buchanan does nothing. And with threats of the Union crumbling and growing pressure to negotiate, Lincoln held firm. Slavery would never be extended to the national territories. And he wrote to many Republican leaders to, quote, stand firm. The tug has to come, and better now than any time hereafter, end quote. Lincoln did, however, attempt to cool passions, or at least buy time, by secretly sending to Seward proposals to be put forth in the Senate. If actually taken up, unlikely, they would protect slavery where it existed. And these proposals included, no federal interference in the institution, enforcement of a modified fugitive slave law with the right of trial by jury for captured alleged slaves, and the promise of a possible constitutional convention in the near future. With the crisis deepening, and I should say, look, Lincoln believed, constitutional scholars believed, this is a state institution, slavery, and it could not be constitutionally interfered with by the federal government except by constitutional amendment. Of course, this will be an evolving issue throughout the war. And with this crisis deepening and the pressure building, Seward announced that he would address the Senate on January 12th. Can you imagine the expectation? It was already known that he would be the Secretary of State. And many looked to him as the premier of this incoming administration. In fact, Seward viewed himself in this light. And on the 12th, the Senate chamber was packed with elected officials and everyday citizens and heavy anticipation. Many hoped, beyond hope, that Henry Seward could pull off a miracle. And he rose to address his fellow senators and countrymen, and a deep hush fell in this pillared room. In the speech, he brought even hardened Southern senators to tears in describing our common heritage and the horrors of disunion and civil war. And he offered many of the compromises and olive branches secretly sent by Lincoln, to no avail. Many of the senators and people there had already been called home by their states, citizens of the United States of America, no longer. Seward cited Jefferson that, in leadership of a free society, you must not only consider your own views, but, quote, those with whom you must necessarily act. We must be content to lead when we can, and to follow when we cannot lead. And if we cannot at any time do for our country all the good that we would wish, we must be satisfied with doing for all the good that we can. In the chamber, usually restricted by silence, burst into applause. Perhaps there was hope after all. Of course, Frances, his abolitionist wife, was sorely disappointed with her husband. Writing to him, the speech, quote, fails to meet with the entire approval of those who love you best. Compromise based on the idea that the preservation of the Union is more important than the liberty of nearly 4 million human beings cannot be right, cannot be approved by God, or supported by good men. End quote. Damn. Look, that is a good and valid argument. And absolute morality and inflexible positions in politics can lead to greater suffering in the real world. Seward agreed that slavery was evil, but he needed the border states, or the Union and its experiment in popular government would be lost to the world. Look, if you lose the border states and you take this idealistic stance, slavery is preserved, the South successfully secedes and is a separate country, and slavery is perpetuated for generations further than it would have been. Ideals, as a necessity, must clash with reality. And Seward's goal was to buy needed time and not to cast out the border states. God knows they'd be essential to prevail in a civil war. As Lincoln later said, quote, I'd like to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. Compared to the states of the Deep South already leaving, the border states like Virginia and Kentucky, Missouri, they were much stronger in population, in resources, in industry. And Seward wrote to his wife, quote, madmen North and madmen South are working together to produce dissolution of the Union by civil war. And he went on, quote, I must gain time for the new administration to organize and for the frenzy of passion to subside. To this end, he was in constant contact with leaders of the border states, trying to hold the country together. And many looked to Seward, not to Lincoln, for a peaceful solution. So out west, at the end of a cold January, Abraham embarked on a pilgrimage to his past. And before going to Washington, he wanted to see his stepmom, Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln. Yeah, I know, long name. Sarah had always encouraged and emotionally supported her son. They loved each other, very much so. And it was said that he was her favorite, even over her own flesh and blood. And when he went to leave, she began to weep, tears rolling down her cheeks, and it startled Lincoln. And he tried to comfort her. And, who amongst us has not tried to comfort or quiet the concerns of a worried parent? In recalling this moment many years later, Sarah Lincoln remembered the quote, I did not want Abe to run for president, did not want him elected, was afraid somehow or other that something would happen to him and that I should see him no more. Lincoln, seeing her distress, and after understanding, what was wrong, he said, No, Mama, trust in the Lord and all will be well. We will see each other again. of course, her tears were right. Also, damn it, call your moms. Tell them you love them if you can. Do it. Do it now. Where was I? Right. Mid-February. By mid-February, Virginia and Tennessee and a number of other border states had chosen to stay with the Union for now. And they would watch Washington and wait and for the new president to assume the burden of command. So far, the center of action had been around the soon-to-be Secretary of State. And according to Walter Starr, Seward actually told a foreign dignitary that, quote, there's no great difference between an elected president of the United States and a hereditary monarch. The actual direction of affairs belongs to the leader of the ruling party. I wonder who he meant. Anyway, thus, we got a glimpse into his mind before the start of the administration. After reassuring his mother, Lincoln returned to Springfield, to tie up loose ends, say goodbyes, pack up his life. The house on 8th and Jackson was rented out. Caretakers were found for his dog. And before he left, he went to see Billy Herndon, his law partner for the last 16 years, in their shabby offices. And after they were finished up, tying loose ends with the business, they walked downstairs to the street. And outside the door, Lincoln looked up at the sign and said, let it hang there undisturbed. Give our clients to understand that the election of a president makes no change in the firm of Lincoln and Herndon. If I live, I'm coming back sometime. And then we'll go right on practicing law as if nothing ever happened. On the rainy morning of February 11th, Lincoln loaded the train for D.C., and hundreds of friends and neighbors had assembled to send him off. He had to say something, and he turned to address the large crowd, emotion threatening to overtake his voice. And he said, "My friends, no one, not in my situation, can appreciate my feelings of sadness at this parting. To this place, and the kindness of these people, I owe everything. Here I've lived a quarter of a century, and I have passed from a young to an old man. Here my children have been born, and one is buried. I now leave, not knowing when or whether ever I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington. I bid you an affectionate farewell." And with that, I propose to raise a glass to home and to old friends. In the next episode, A Journey by Train, Independence Hall, A Sacred Oath, and Let's Slip the Dogs of War. And I hope you've enjoyed this episode as much as I've enjoyed my writer's tears. Man, I really should reach out to them. Anyway. Special thanks to my second Patreon supporter, Nate B. It means a lot. And of course, a shout out to my wonderful Lisa, who I imagine threatened and blackmailed friends and co-workers to listen and review this podcast. As always, check out my reading recommendations on romancesofhistory.com. You're welcome. And before we part ways, a quote. "I consider the central idea pervading this struggle is the necessity that is upon us of proving that popular government is not an absurdity. We must settle this question now. Whether in a free government, the minority have the right to break up the government whenever they choose." A. Lincoln. Remember, you're not alone. You have friends. Some you haven't even met yet. This is Bo, signing off.